founding fathers, take a look around. Is trouble coming? Are we going down? Mother, daughter, and your brother too. Get your mind straight when it's up to you. Hey, you gotta see the storm a-coming. Hey, you gotta feel it coming through. Hey, you gotta see the storm a-coming. Whoa, it's coming after you. When the snake bites.
Hello, my name is Greg Seagroves, and today's date is July the 6th, 2020. I'm here with Jimmy Catrone, and I'm here with Connor McDaniel, my producer, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. I know it's a couple days after the 4th of July, but I think it's still relevant. Y'all have a good 4th?
I did. We had some friends and some neighbors over, did a little barbecuing, and life is good.
A good deal. All right. Well, I know he was at my house, and so
Yeah.
we had some very spirited discussions, and
Oh, yeah.
I got a little passionate, and,
Oh, man, I made him mad. It was funny.
he kind of got on my skin there a little bit, but
Dude, I made a joke at the wrong time, apparently.
well, you know,
What sounds it? Is it something I can use for future, or I can get under his skin a little bit?
Anyway, how about that independence?
but anyway, I want to talk about the Declaration of Independence. You know, I was telling Jimmy earlier before we started recording about when I read the Bible, a lot of times I'm just in awe of the things that you read in the Bible, and I guess you have to have the Holy Spirit and able to feel this way when you really realize that that's God speaking, because some of the concepts in the Bible are just so deep and awe-inspiring. They couldn't have been written, or man could not have come up with those things. And that's kind of the way I look at Declaration of Independence. This is a secular document, but yet it's about as close as man can get to being sacred, to being spiritual without actually being religious, I guess you could say. But anyway, I think the thing that we have to do in this country, some way or another, we got to figure out how to do this, is we got to find a way to teach our kids about Declaration of Independence, the philosophical underpinning of what our country is all about, what our government is all about. I've heard people say that Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are two separate documents, which they are, but I've heard people say one doesn't have anything to do with the other, which I totally disagree with that. I don't think the people that signed the Declaration of Independence, I think it was 51 men who signed it, there's any way that many of those later turned around and signed the Constitution. I don't think that they would have formed a government that was not based upon the principles in the Declaration of Independence. They had fought a war for 8 years based on those principles, and so I don't think I think the Constitution is the how-to book, basically, how to make a government work. Declaration of Independence is the spiritual underpinning of all of it. So I want to get into the actual text of the Declaration of Independence. It says in Congress, July 4th, 1776, unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. What I was getting ready to say a while ago, I think we need to change the narrative. The left is good at the narrative. They don't care about facts and figures. They don't care. You can throw all the facts you want to at them, but they control the narrative. A narrative being white cops are killing black people by the hundreds. That's not true, but that's the narrative. Republicans hate the poor. They hate the working man. That's the narrative. You can go on and on, anything you want to come up with. Now, it may not be based on truth, but because they have the media, they have our schools, our colleges, they can create the narrative. So what we've got to do is we've got to come back and say, okay, well, here's our narrative. The Democrat, if you look at the history of this country, it's the Democratic Party that has caused the major problems that we are plagued with today. You can trace it back pretty much, whether it's crime in the cities, whether it's waste in the cities, whether it's economic stagnation, anything you want to come up with, whether it's racism, whatever, can be all traced back to the Democratic Party. That's the narrative we need to create. And we need to stress these documents, our founding documents. It's like Abraham Lincoln said that his greatest, the things that influenced him the most as a child and as an adult were the Bible, Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. And I think that is what we need to change things around in this country. We have to get that narrative across to everyone, and we have to get that narrative across to our children, in order to change things.
So in that first statement, actually, is that a full sentence, what you read? That was one of the
Yeah,
first?
that was the very beginning of the Declaration of Independence.
Right. In there, it's using phrases, state of nature, and what does nature's God mean?
Well, when they said state of nature, like when John Locke, who was an early philosopher, he wrote the Second Treatise of Government, and in that he said that when he was talking about state of nature is a theoretical model, okay, that philosophers used during that period, during I guess you would call the Renaissance, during that era. That, in essence, it's kind of like Adam and Eve. Okay, Adam and Eve were born in a state. Well, no, they were created in a state of nature. Okay. Now, in the theoretical model that they talked about, state of nature was a situation where we were all here. We had freedom. We had total freedom, but it was chaotic. When you have total freedom, it's chaos. Okay. So we had to, if you have total freedom, then you got to calm things down a little bit. Like men are selfish animals. So if they live in a total state of freedom, it's just going to be chaotic. Okay, you pretty much do anything you want. You can do anything to your neighbor you want, whatever. So this is where you have to bring in the concept of state of nature, and nature's God. Okay, so man gets his rights not from the state, but from God. Like you have the divine right of kings, okay? Divine right of kings in England and Europe and France and places like that. They said that the king got his rights from God, okay? But they turned all this on its head and said, no, the individual gets his rights from God, okay, in that state of nature. So let me continue here so we can kind of understand how we come to a situation where things level out, things are not as chaotic. We bring about order. Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, on the self-evident part, well, first of all, let me just say this. Notice how they say, we hold these truths. Notice how there's no ambivalence here. You know, like in the modern age, everything's relevant. We have moral relativism, where, you know, Connor, he sees something that's true, and you see something that's true, and y'all are equal in your truths. In other words, his truth is true, your truth is true. That's not what they're saying here. It said there's certain things that are true, period, okay? And it also says, and it's self-evident. Now, the definition of self-evident is without proof or demonstration. It's axiomatic. Axiomatic means obvious without argument. It's like when you
based on a reasonable person.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that's what self-evident is supposed to mean. If you're a normal, sane person, in other words, like if you walk out tonight and you see the moon in the sky, that's self-evident. The moon is there. You know, you go outside and you breathe. You know, that's self-evident that there's air, oxygen that you're breathing. So there's things that cannot be argued with. Okay, that's what they were talking about.
I mean, you never heard of moon truthers then?
I knew there had to be somebody like that.
Man. I met one. I'm being dead serious.
Well, no, you probably are. I mean, did they belong to the Flat Earth Society or what?
Well, actually, this one did, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Total coincidence, though.
But anyway, they all agreed on these things. All the signers. That's why they signed this thing. They were unanimous. Then we get to the point that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. And I notice they're talking about a Creator. You know, we didn't evolve, we were created. Okay, now these were men that not all of them agreed on their religious views. You know, some were deists. You know, a deist is a person who believes that there was a God and he created the universe, and but he just sat back and said, okay, it's yours, you do what you want to, I'm out of here, you know. That's kind of what a deist was. And then you had some that were true Christians. You know, they believe the way most Christians that like us in this room believe, that God is involved in our lives, and you know, there's providence and all that. And but the key thing here is that they believed in a God. Okay, now the question comes up. Is that, can you, in this form of government, can you be an atheist and be a true citizen? You know, now, John Locke, in his Second Treatise of Government, he didn't believe that an atheist could be a legitimate citizen, because you have to believe in God in order to believe in our form of government. because that's where your rights come from. And but Jefferson did believe that atheists could be citizens. There were some, everything that Jefferson wrote, pretty much, in Declaration of Independence, pretty much were plagiarized from what John Locke said in his second treatise of government. The only difference is that John Locke said life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, where Jefferson said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So how or what phrase in the Declaration legitimizes an atheist? How did they state that?
Well, they didn't. I mean,
okay.
I'm just saying as a belief. If you read the writings of Thomas Jefferson,
it's captured there.
Yeah, that he would agree that he was for religious freedom. He believed that everybody should believe the way they wanted to believe.
They don't cross that bridge of.
No, you don't. It's not addressed in the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
The word atheist kind of defines itself, doesn't it? Like atheist, non-theist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you don't believe in or you're. You're the
I mean,
opposite of a theist.
In terms of the Declaration, what to do about that person? Where does that person fall in? And
deported.
He answered my question. Jefferson was writing about it, acknowledging and accepting it, but not everybody agreed on that.
No, like I say, there's probably a lot of debate. At least would be among the founders, I would say.
It seems faulty to begin with, because if you don't believe in God, how are you going to believe in rights?
Yeah, I mean,
it fails the litmus test.
Yeah, if your rights come from God and you don't believe in God,
you're right from the get go.
It's Glenn Beck, he was talking about this, and he said, well, okay, you don't believe in God, well, believe in a big purple people eater out there that gave you powers or whatever, But anyway, it is a legitimate question, because if you believe that, the reason, we are given rights from God is that because man can't take those rights away. Anything given by God can only be taken away by God. Okay, that's what is so different about our form of government, is that. And that's what I think so awesome about our form of government, is that it tells me that I have, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but it talks about inalienable rights, okay? An inalienable right is a God-given right. And, the freedom of speech is a God-given right. The freedom to worship is a God-given right. The freedom to have a newspaper or the press or the media, that's a God-given right. The freedom to defend yourself, self-defense, and also the ability to overthrow your government if it becomes tyrannical. That's a God-given right. The right to a jury, the right to a jury of your peers, a right to a speedy trial. All these things are fundamental God-given rights that can't be taken away, not legally, from you. Now, does that mean somebody's going to come along and take them away? You bet you. They'll try, and that's of course, I want to get into that a little later. And one thing I wanted to talk about, the inalienable rights. Of course, the Declaration of Independence says unalienable rights. That's really kind of a typo. It should be inalienable rights, but it doesn't matter. Unalienable, inalienable. But there's also an alienable right. An alienable right is a right that the state can take away from you. Like the right to drive is an alienable right. The government can take your license away, and he's not really violating, or they're not really violating your inalienable rights.
Well, they would consider, or the government considers driving a privilege, don't they?
It's a privilege. Anything that's a privilege.
So basically, an alienable right is a privilege.
A privilege. It's basically a privilege. Inalienable right is something that you just have, and nobody can take that away from you. Let's go back to the state of nature. State of nature. And what you had to do, man decided that he had to form a government that represented him, that would, in other words, they would give up these people in a state of nature, in order to bring about order from chaos, would form a government, and they would come up with a social contract. The contract was between the people and the government. Okay, now the people were the boss, or they were the lords over the government. The power devolved from the people. They were giving up some of their rights in order to secure most of their rights. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So you're giving up some of your rights in order to secure most of your rights, and you have a social contract. Okay, the social contract, in essence, it's like any other contract. If you make a contract with somebody, you're having a room built on your house or something like that, he agrees to a certain thing and you agree to a certain thing, and if one of the other parties doesn't fulfill that contract, it's no longer valid. Okay, that's kind of what we do with the government. We come up with a contract, a social contract with our government that said, okay, this is what you have to do, okay? If you violate this contract, then we have the right to alter or abolish this contract. And so that's basically what the Declaration of Independence is saying, is that they have the right. This is what the Second Amendment's all about, is that they have the right to alter. Now, alter can be just vote people out of office, or the people that are causing the problem. Abolish could be a revolution, Now, Thomas Jefferson, he was pretty radical on this. He believed that we should have a revolution every 20 years. He had a saying that the tree of liberty is watered by the blood of tyrants and patriots, and blood is like manure to the tree of liberty. So he was pretty radical about this idea of revolution. Now I'm not sure I'd go along with Jefferson every 20 years, but another thing that has to happen is, okay, you've got the right of revolution, you got the social contract, but what happens is that you don't break that government apart for light and transient causes. It has to be a long train of abuses, okay, and so you have to, in order to break that contract, you have to establish. This is what they were saying in the Declaration of Independence. They list all these things that the King of England had done to usurp their freedoms as Englishmen, and they were making their case for revolution. You technically, in order to fall under being justified by the Declaration of Independence as far as a revolution, you can't just up and say, well, I'm going to have a revolution and we're going to overthrow you. You got to have a reason, so then you make your case just like a lawyer in court. You put out all the charges against that, the person you're rebelling against or the government you're rebelling against. And what people don't realize about inalienable rights is that if let's say you're the president of the United States or the dictator or whatever, and you start coming around and you censor me. You won't let me you won't let me protest. You won't let me have free speech. You won't let me have my printing presses, my media. You try to take my guns away. What you're doing is you're usurping those rights from me, and so if you usurp enough rights from me, then you become a tyrant, okay? And once you become a tyrant, then there's no other alternative for me but to get rid of you, okay? Or as a people to get rid of that tyrant,
Well, that sounds like, in the case of England, it sounded like you made a comparison to England, where England was usurping the rights.
Right.
But that would mean that they had those rights, and then England began to take them away. But
that's what they felt,
But is that accurate, or I thought those rights did not exist anyway?
Well, see, on the Patriots considered themselves Englishmen. They didn't consider themselves American. Oh, what we think of as Americans today. And under English common law, they felt like their rights were being trampled upon. I mean, here's like a list.
But wasn't that a new conclusion for them? It wasn't.
No, this has been going on for years. I mean, you got to look at take the mercantile system, okay, that they were under. Everybody talks about taxation without representation. That was a problem. That was a big problem. But they, under the mercantile system, you had your trading partners had to be whoever England's trading partners were. Okay, you could, if you traded with anybody that England said you couldn't trade with, then the only way you had to break the law. You had to be a smuggler.
Right. I'm just trying to understand usurp, the definition of usurp when you mean it.
Well, it's just
let's go to they're in America, and they own a plot of land and they're growing crops, and they make a decision not to give a portion of those crops and the rewards of the crops back to England, not to turn the money back to England. That would be new. That would be a new action against.
But if England came in and took your crops and took your money and all that, then they would be guilty of usurpation.
But isn't usurping authority that I thought that they had the right to do it, and then usurping means you're deciding to reverse that and suddenly say, well, okay, you used to keep the money when you were in America, but now we're deciding we want to collect on that money.
Right. It might be something you were doing for a long time.
It could go either way then. I guess.
Okay. I mean, but basically, we remember the people are supreme. The people are the ones that are really, that the government answers to the people. Okay, so
in a new concept.
Well, under our form of government,
right? Okay,
and so if the government is doing something to take away the rights, our fundamental rights, then they are usurping. Like for example, let's say they take away our right to free speech, but they allow us to keep our right to worship the way we want, or have a free press. They let us keep our guns and all. They've usurped one of our rights. Right. Okay. Now, let's say then they come along and they say, you can't have a press anymore. You can't have your guns anymore. You can't, we're not going to allow you to have a jury trial anymore. Then you can make a case for tyranny at that point, because they've usurped these fundamental rights from you. That's the way it works. Okay. But here's some of the things that they were charging the King of England with. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. I could keep reading. It gets kind of boring, but it's just a long list of charges against the king that he has. These are the rights he's usurped from the colonies, which gives them the right to rebel. Now you had another group of people out there that
I guess what I'm meaning is the colonists changed the rules.
I don't understand what you mean by changing the rules.
They were used to government under England. That's what they were used to.
Right, but they
came over to America, and I guess they initially started as they were supposed to be following those things as a colony. Is that accurate? They're supposed to be
who's they?
The colonists.
Okay.
They came over, they colonized, and they were supposed to be following the rules of England as a colony.
Okay.
Well, that's kind of the problem, ain't it? Because you're basically under the rule of the king, but you're not what was the whole problem? Taxation without representation, right?
Yeah, well, that's a geographic
problem.
But I mean, I just mean in basic theory.
Well, here's where
the revolt.
Here's where Americans were unique. Okay, when they got here, they were so far away from England.
I get that.
Okay,
they couldn't be
controlled. They couldn't be just stand right over them and say, "Okay, do this, do that."
I get that.
So this is one reason we're kind of unique, is because we developed an independent spirit for many, many years before the revolution came along. We were into self-government already. Each colony was ruling itself pretty much the way it wanted to, okay? And so what happened was, I'll tell you what really caused the problem, was that in the French and Indian War, I think the French and Indian War started in 1753, I think, and lasted to about 1763, I think. Okay, well, the English won that war, but it nearly bankrupted the English treasury, okay? And
fighting long distance.
Yeah, because they were fighting. The reason they call it the French and Indian War was because the French were in North America. French and English were traditional enemies. The French were whipping up their Indian allies to attack us. But see, this is one reason that Americans got really irritated over this, was because actually, before it was over with, the French and Indian War became a world war. Okay, they were fighting out on the ocean and everywhere. Okay, and but eventually England won. We drove the French out of the North American continent. Okay, but this is what made the Americans mad. For the most part, the English did help provide some troops and everything, but for the most part, it was our militias, it was our people that was actually doing most of the fighting. They were doing most of the protecting of the colonies. But because England was in so much debt after the war, they were trying to recoup that money, okay? And they were using the argument, well, we did this for you, so you need to help pay for it, okay? And so what they were doing, they passed, I think the Stamp Act was the first thing they passed, and the Americans, they raised so much cane that finally they did away with the Stamp Act. But then they would go to another act, and they would. It was like England was determined. They would put one act out there, get rid of it, put another act out there, get rid of it, and go to the next thing. But it was like England was determined to show the Americans, hey, who's in charge, okay? And that you're going to have to pay whether you like it or not, and you're not going to have anybody over here representing you in our parliament to have a voice or a say in all this, okay? So it was the independent spirit coming to the surface with Americans.
Did Americans ever have representation in England, like someone who would physically go back?
They had like kind of like Washington D.C. has a shadow senator. You know, like I can't remember exactly what they called it. I know Benjamin Franklin was over there for a few years prior to the American Revolution.
Right.
Trying to represent a certain group of colonies over there, but they treated him so badly. That's where Benjamin Franklin really became a patriot, is because he got over there and they abused him and mocked him and made fun of him and everything in Parliament. And he held his ground real well, but it did, something changed within Benjamin Franklin out there. That's where he went from loyalist to patriot overnight. He realized that, hey, things had to change. And even by the time they wrote this, Declaration of Independence, the war started in 1775, and by the time this was drafted in July 4th, 1776, there were still people who called themselves patriots that were wanting to come to an accommodation with England. They still hadn't got it yet. They still hadn't realized they were in this war up to their elbows, but they were still thinking that they could talk sense into the English and the English would come around, But by this time, people were starting to see the writing on the wall. More and more people were starting to realize that we're in it to win it. We've got to be. But as late as the Declaration of Independence, you still had people that, I'm talking about among the founding fathers, who wanted to work out some kind of compromise with England. They thought that they could. But actually, see, another thing too is among the patriots, they didn't really realize who they were fighting. Many of the patriots thought that the big boogeyman was Parliament, but it wasn't. It was, they were part of it, but the big boogeyman was George III himself, King George III. He was the one that was the driving force behind that war, it was kind of like their Vietnam. They were trying to fight this war long distance. They were the most powerful military on earth, just like the United States was during Vietnam. But they made a lot of mistakes, the way they fought the war, the way they pressed the war. And the Americans were able to hold on and just finally get to the point where they wore the English down. The country became war weary, and so when the news came of Yorktown and King George III heard about it, they'd already been almost 8 years into this war. And it was such an embarrassment to the English, and he knew that the jig is up. We're going to have to negotiate a peace, and that's what happened. Because he knew he had lost the will of the people to stand behind him. Basically, kind of the way we got in Vietnam. That people just got tired. They just got tired. We've been in that war so long, and so many people had died, and we couldn't see what we were gaining from it. And that's kind of what. But that's the way a lot of wars, end. It's, if you could just hold on. That's what Washington did. That's the beauty of his strategy. Is that at first, he tried to win, just like Robert E. Lee. He tried to attack the British head on, and he expended all kinds of casualties and stuff like that. But he came to realize that the British were just too powerful. He could not defeat them head on. So what he did was his strategy was to fight not to lose. Not to win, but not to lose. This is what happened. Washington knew that if he kept the army alive, the United States was alive. If it died, the United States died. you know. And so that's what it came down to, was on the battlefield.
That's an interesting strategy.
Well, yeah, and
I
really,
mean, it's a little tough for morale, I would imagine.
oh yeah, especially somebody like Washington, because this is where Washington and Lee, Robert E. Lee, were very similar. Was that they were very aggressive people. You know, when you look at Washington, you look at Lee, you don't think of aggressive, okay? Because their temperaments are so controlled. You know, they kept their temper. They never hardly ever lost their temper except on a rare occasion, stuff like that. But inside they were very aggressive. They wanted to get at the enemy. That's all Washington wanted to do, was get at the British. He wanted to take New York back. You know, he almost met disaster in New York. But see, Washington wasn't the general that Robert E. Lee was. But where Washington was smarter than Lee was that Lee took the offensive defensive strategy where he was trying to outright defeat the North, and they were just too powerful to do that. I mean, he wanted that decisive victory that would cause them to go to the peace table. But if he had adapted the same strategy that Washington did, who knows, the South might have won an armistice, you know, and that's another program sometime, but, you know, talk about that. But anyway, I think I've covered most of the bases. You know, I just believe that the United States, if we would teach the Declaration of Independence and what this is all about, what that document is all about, and teach the Bill of Rights and the Constitution itself to our kids, I mean, this would be such a different society today if this was what we stressed to our kids. That in American history and what it all means, you know. That's what we're dealing with now. These kids are out here doing all this stuff. I think some of them know exactly what they're doing, but I think a big percentage of them don't. I mean, they're tearing Frederick Douglass statue down. They're tearing Abraham Lincoln, U.S. Grant. I just wonder how many of these kids even know who they are, you know, and what they stood for.
I think a lot of it comes down to when you look at history of anything, you know, history of the world, you have good, bad, and you have ugly.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, they educate themselves on the bad and the ugly, and they don't realize there's a lot of good in American history.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, take we live under a government that was originally designed to protect our God-given rights. We live in a country that grants us or protects our freedom, not grants us freedom, but protects our freedom. And we have a lot of heroes that in our history that fought to protect that. And, you know, people fail to see that, you know, and they go out and they educate, or, you know, mostly the media and the colleges educate the youth on, you know, the bad and the ugly. And they never point out, hey, America has a whole lot of good, especially when you compare it to other countries around the world. And, you know, you can't really point out a people group that doesn't have just as ugly, if not uglier, past than we do.
And you got to compare that with, look at our past, but look where we are. We're still a country. It's like I was listening to a lady the other day that was a refugee from Somalia, and she said, America is the best place in the world for a black person to live. It's the best place in the world for a gay person to live. It's the best place in the world for a transgender person to live. It's the best place in the world for someone who has a particular religion. You know, she just went down the list. And this is good when you see a person who is from a totally different society and especially from the third world society. And she knows, she said when she got to the Netherlands that she went up and asked a police officer for help. And she said she would have never done that in her country of Somalia. You didn't ever go up to a police officer in Africa and ask them for help. You know, this is the difference between a Western European nation or America, you know. And we, you know, we talk about the bad things. You know, look at this is what makes me mad about what a lot of people are doing, like these Marxists that are there, and these radical Islamists who are they're taking our freedoms that we have, and they're using our freedoms to enslave us. Okay, that's what bothers me about all this. They're taking advantage of the very freedoms we have to enslave us.
Well, it's just like a tactic of war.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, that's just what they do.
Yeah. And you take, like, when we talk about history, okay, the ugly side of George Washington, he owned slaves, okay? I get that, okay? But George Washington made this democratic experience that we're dealing with today, he made it all possible. Without George Washington, we would not be here. You talk about an essential man. If there's one person in all of history that's essential to the United States, it's George Washington. And not only that, fighting for 8 years as our general that won against England, the most powerful country on earth. And then you have, when we sat down he came to our rescue 3 different times. And then when the Constitution was being developed or written, they went in there not to make a new Constitution, but they went in there to reform the Articles of Confederation, okay? But the presence of George Washington was the only thing that held that thing together. You know, by him being there, people had so much respect for that man that it gave the Constitutional Convention validity. It gave them the authority to come up with a new Constitution, okay? And then later he becomes our first president. And look at the things he did. He said, I don't want to be, you know, and think about this for a minute. We had a revolution, and he went, instead of becoming king or a dictator, he went home to his plantation, to his farm as a civilian. This is why they called him, you know, they had the order of Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a Roman general that did the same thing. He went out and won the wars. He could have been anything he wanted to be in Rome, and he went home to his farm, you know. And this is why they call Washington the second Cincinnatus, so to speak, because, I mean, he turned his back. And George III, who had been his biggest nemesis, when they told George III,
Wait, who is George III?
he's the king of England.
Okay.
King George III, okay? When they told King George III that Washington was going home, he was going to step down from power and go home to his plantation, he said if he does that, he's the greatest man that ever lived, or something to that effect, okay? Because he even understood power. He understood if you can turn your back on power, you're a great person. You know what I'm saying? And so then you know, he helped us form our government, and then he became our president, and again he turned his back on power. He served 8 years. He said, that's long enough. It's time for me to step down and go home, you know, and let somebody else have it.
And he also approached the position as a servant. That's another thing.
He was a servant of the people. And to tell you, I was in Mount Vernon this past summer, and in their museum there, they had Washington's Rules of Civility, okay? And I was amazed by these things. He memorized these things his entire life, okay? It was just things like common courtesy and manners and things like that. And where it came to the forefront was after Washington had served 8 years, and he was no longer president. He was on the podium, and there was John Adams, who was elected president of the United States. He just gave his inaugural speech, and there was Thomas Jefferson. And so they got up to leave, and Washington stood back and refused to walk off the podium until Adams and Jefferson walked off first. What he was saying to them was, "I'm no longer in power. You're the people now. You're the ones that are in power. You're the ones worthy of respect." And it led to an awkward moment there between Jefferson and Washington, because he's standing there waiting for Washington to go out, and Washington said, "No, you go." This guy just, it was like he was sitting back and thinking, like he's on TV. Everybody's watching him, but he knows that his audience is not just the people that lived during his time. We were his audience. We were learning from his life, and
he wanted to set a precedent.
Yeah, he set a precedent. He knew that. It was like he knew he was looking into the future, And you take, look at Lincoln. I did an article on him. Before we get to Lincoln, let's look at Andrew Jackson. Okay, Andrew Jackson. When you look at his life, he did some horrible things. I mean, what he did to the Indians were inexcusable. Okay, what he did. He was a slave owner, the whole bit. That's the bad side of Andrew Jackson. Okay, but look what he stood for, though, is that he made it possible for the white male, the white man, to become more democratic. Before Andrew Jackson, not that many people, period, voted, okay? So, yes, okay, the white man become more democratic. He was able to vote. That's why they call it Jacksonian democracy, okay? But you got to look at that as that was the good to come out of Andrew Jackson. He set the precedent where he laid the groundwork, even though it only affected the white male, that eventually spread to black men. It is eventually spread to women, to everyone. That democratic spirit that he started eventually spread to everybody. So that's why you got to look at history. You can't look at everything that Jackson did. There were some other things he did, like beating the best army that the British had at the Battle of New Orleans, and saving all that territory for the United States, the Louisiana Purchase. You got to give him credit for that,
Yeah, and you can call Jackson a terrible, terrible man all you want to, but whenever, election time comes around, you got to think like, well, otherwise, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be doing this right now.
Right. I mean, it was the stepping stone to get where we're at now. Okay. Now, look at Abraham Lincoln. I could show you stuff that blow your mind about Abraham Lincoln. Okay. It would alter your opinion of him forever. Okay. When it comes to race. I did an article that said, was Abraham Lincoln a racist? Based on what he said about black people, there's no other opinion you can come to. Most of what he was saying, one thing about Lincoln, he was a man of, he could assume the room, so to speak. When he was in the debates with Stephen A. Douglas during his famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas would get to race baiting and put Lincoln on the spot. So look who Lincoln was talking to. He was talking to his fellow Illinoisans. I don't know if I'm saying that right. At that time, were very prejudiced, very racist. Illinois had a law that black people couldn't even move into the state. Okay, so he was standing in order to get the office of the Senate. He was basically letting everybody know he was just as racist as Stephen A. Douglas. Now, it's hard to determine if Lincoln really believed what he was saying, or if he was saying it for political pragmatic reasons.
Sounds like modern politics.
Well, absolutely. Lincoln was a politician. As great as we think he was today, that's the greatness of Lincoln to a point, because but here's where you got to look at Lincoln. When the war started, he was that Lincoln that debated Stephen A. Douglas in 1858, but he was saying, but Lincoln always, even back in those days when he was spouting this racist stuff, he always was against slavery. Okay, slavery was a moral evil to him. Okay, always was. Even his father was that way. Okay, that's the reason they moved from Kentucky to Indiana and then finally to Illinois, to get away from slavery. But anyway, when the war broke out, or in 1861, the whole cause of the Union was to preserve the Union. It wasn't about slavery. That's the politician Lincoln coming out, okay? But as soon as he got the opportunity, as soon as he saw the opportunity, he started working on destroying the institution of slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. There was a man that had the ability to adapt to each situation, and when the opportunity arose, he took it. Okay. Now, at first, it was just an executive order. It could be revoked by the next president that came in. But what he did, it was a brilliant move. When you look at the Emancipation Proclamation, it was one of the most brilliant things that anybody could come up with in the middle of a civil war, because there was so much that this one executive order did to hurt the South. Okay. It ultimately had a big impact on the South losing the war, okay? And that's the brilliance of Abraham Lincoln. But then, as the war winds down, he realizes that the South is losing. Then he is able to he sees the end of slavery. He actually can see the end of slavery, and he pushes for the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. And it was his actual moves, his political clout that brought that about. Okay, if you need to watch the movie Lincoln. It tells all about that. It's a brilliant movie that depicts all this. Okay,
and timing is everything.
Yeah, timing, but that's the thing. That's the greatness of Lincoln, is that he was able to. But see, one thing about Lincoln was, you can be the biggest abolitionist in the world. You can be egalitarian in 1861, but if you can't get elected, you can't help nobody. You know what I'm saying? So he was smart enough to realize this. And then by the time, he's assassinated, he's saying things like, well, I think the most intelligent black people and the soldiers that fought for us in the Civil War ought to get the right to vote.
Pushing it to the next level.
He's pushing it to the next level, okay? Who knows where Lincoln would have been if he'd lived, eventually, okay?
Yeah.
And so that's the greatness of Abraham Lincoln, And then you take, but it's kind of funny. The three people that have done more for civil rights that were presidents of the United States were probably three of the most racist people ever in their personal life. And that, of course, I've already talked about Lincoln. Harry Truman, he even tried one time to get in good with his voters. He even tried one time to join the Klan in Missouri. Okay, at the last minute, he changed his mind. But here was a guy who used the N-word constantly in his regular everyday life. And but when it came down to when the soldiers were coming back from World War II, the black soldiers, and they were going home to the South, and they were being beaten to death and tortured, and this bothered Truman. This upset his sense of fairness, and he's the one that signed the executive order that integrated the armed forces. He's the one that wanted to put a civil rights plank in the 1948 Democratic platform, which caused the birth of the Dixiecrats. You know, Strom Thurmond's party broke away from the Democratic Party. He's the one that, he was for. He had a sense of justice. Okay, look at Lyndon Johnson. Okay, now here was a guy who used the N-word all the time, but yet he helped push through the 1957 Civil Rights Act, first Civil Rights Act since the Reconstruction. Okay, helped push through the 1960 Civil Rights Act, pushed through the 1964 Civil Rights Act, pushed through the 1965 Civil Rights Act, and Lyndon Johnson died when in the early 1970s, and probably was using the N-word up to the very last. Okay, and everybody wants to try to say that Lyndon Johnson changed. He had some kind of epiphany. I don't know where it happened at, because he never really changed in his personal life. But the point I'm trying to make here is the three people, and they were all Southerners, because technically Abraham Lincoln was born in the South. He was born in Kentucky. And the Middle West back then had a heavy Southern influence, in Indiana and Illinois. So all three of these guys were Southerners, but yet they did more for civil rights than anybody. So the point I'm making here is that you got to look at history. You got to take the bad with the good. And I don't think you'll find a nation on earth that has a history. Yes, it's troubling, but it's very rich in terms of, you see the forces of good always working. You can kind of compare this with Jesus. Look at the movie Passion of the Christ. And everywhere Jesus went, you always see Satan trailing right behind him. Where there's good, there's bad. You tell me any nation on earth that doesn't have a lot of these nations, these third world countries, you look at their history, it's mostly bad. I don't know of a country out there that's mostly good. But I think the United States they can put their history up against anybody. But anyway, I guess this is a good place to quit. Anybody got anything else?
Nope.
All right. Well, Connor, you want to end with prayer, man?
Lord God, I thank you for my grandfather here, and I thank you for our friend Jimmy. Lord, I believe that you're sovereign. I believe in the providence, Lord. And, no matter what is in our future, no matter what's in our past, Lord, I know that you're in control, and that you elect the presidents and you elect the kings, and you put people in power who need to be in power to fulfill your perfect plan. Lord, I ask if there's anybody listening to this that, they prioritize truth over everything, and they come to a place where they can prioritize truth over everything. Whether that be the truth of the gospel or, the truth of the world you put us in and asked us to steward, Lord. And I ask all these things in your precious holy name. Amen.